We have here our panel for Race Matters, a multicultural perspective of the social construct of race. There is going to be one more panelist, Dr. Mokoena. She is unfortunately stuck in traffic, terrible Manhattan traffic, but she will be here in about 10-15 minutes. We're going to start now without her. Our moderator is Melissa Valle. She is a PhD candidate at Columbia for sociology, and she is on the board of Afro-Latino Forum. She will introduce the rest of our panelists.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Am I on this mic? I'm talking to the mic. Can you hear me? Okay. So we're going to start with, here we have Dr. John Collins. He's an associate professor in the Anthropology Department and director of the Latin American and Latino Studies program at Queens College. His ongoing work on heritage, race, and ethnographic approaches to history and historicity in Latin America gave rise to his first book, Revolt of the Saints, Memory and Redemption in the Twilight of Brazilian Racial Democracy, and to Dr. Collins' current project, Under English Eyes, which examines the ways Africans who arrived on the final slave ship to dock in the city of Salvador Bahia experienced Brazil's 19th century transition to ostensibly free labor. And beside him, we have Dr. Silvio Torres-Saillant, who is a professor in the English department and an affiliated member of the Latino Latin American Studies program in the College of Arts and Sciences at Syracuse University. He founded the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute and co-founded La Casita Cultural Center, whose mission is to create bridges of communication, collaboration, and exchange between Syracuse University and the Latino population of the city. Dr. Torres-Saillant's research and teaching projects relate to race, ethnicity, intellectual history, imperial violence, diaspora, migration, and the problem of culture and civilization. And our third panelist, who's currently not here yet, is Dr. Mokoena. She's an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. Her work looks at the contested histories of South African political ideas and traditions. She completed a book on the Zulu and Kolwa intellectual Majema M. Fuse. Dr. Mokoena's latest project is on the meaning and symbolism of clothing in 19th century colonial Natal, focusing on how 19th century Africans made sartorial choices that blurred the line between clothing and adornment, and how these choices were captured in paintings and photographs. So I welcome all of our panelists here today. And so to start out, I wanted to first talk about when someone says that race is a social construct, what that means, because it's being thrown around a lot now, which is a good thing, because it's a shift from the idea that race is a fixed, objective, genetically determined human characteristic. But I think for a lot of us, we don't really know what that means. So I'd like to start this discussion by just having some of our panelists talk about what it means when people say that race is a social construct.
Well, thank you, Melissa, and thank you, CERRU, and thank you, Yael, thank you, John, for the opportunity to hang out with you here in this panel. Well, basically, what scholars mean when they say that race is socially constructed is that race is not a biological reality, right? But it's something that occurs, something that is created in the process of social relations. But of course, they themselves quite often speak as if they don't believe what they're saying, because quite often you find people, for instance, in the case of Dominicans, right, or in the case of other. I mean, I remember that documentary, Wonders of the African World, led by Professor Henry Louis Gates, in which he is interviewing somebody in East Africa who has Negroid features, but who defines himself on the basis of his Persian origins. Yeah? And Dr. Gates, on the voiceover, the power of the voiceover in the documentary, says, Sheikh so-and-so could say whatever he wants, but we know what he is, right? So evidently, we often say one thing and believe another, right? I actually find it more useful to say that race, not that race is socially constructed, but that race was socially constructed. I would change the verb tense so that we can sort of point our attention to the moment when we became racial. And then everyone born, in the hemisphere at least, everyone born after that creation has it, and will respond to it, even when speaking about race, and even when trying to be anti-racist.
Sure.
I guess I would add to that. I very much agree with what Silvio was putting forth. It's really true when I speak to anthropology students here on campus. They don't believe me that race is socially constructed, right? So what does it mean to say that race is socially constructed? Well, it doesn't mean that it's not powerful, that you don't get beaten up over it or discriminated against, right? But what it's an attempt, and this is where I would add to what was just said, is I would actually say that biology is socially constructed, right? Biology is not a given thing in the world. Biology is composed of sets of processes that are no doubt related to chemistry and materiality and objects and life and vitality. But biology itself is a category that we use to describe all these very varied processes. And somehow over the course of the last few centuries, that has hardened into an idea that there's a thing called biology, and that it's counterposed to the social or to the cultural. But not everybody composes that category in the same way, and the category, I don't know any of you it'd be difficult to stand up and say, well, categories are resolutely natural things, right? The way blood is, or the way love is. Is love natural? Well, I don't know. Don't you love your Nikes? And your Nikes aren't natural. So these borders that we use to make sense of the world are precisely that. They're borders. And race is a border that makes problematic sense of the world. But so is the border between the social and the biological. So when we say race is socially constructed, so too is biology.
And actually, we're gonna, and now we have Dr. Mokoena with us. Thank you. And so let's go around and each of you just kind of describe, as we talk about categories, so how people are categorized by race in your countries of expertise presently, and how this process, we're talking about processes, how this process has evolved over time. So when did racialization take hold? And maybe we can start with Dr. Mokoena?
Yes. I'm sure, can you hear my voice without, okay, I think I'll just put this closer. I'm sorry I missed the introductions and I was just stuck in traffic. The best way of talking about South Africa and race is really to talk about the fact that unlike the Americas, South Africa's racial categories were partly constructed because of its connection with the Indian Ocean, in the sense that the slaves who came to South Africa in the 17th century were coming from the Dutch East Indies. And so many of them were, for example, Muslim. So in South Africa, the construction of race has always been implicated with religion. So they were Muslim and they were often sent to South Africa as exiles. And so South Africa sort of became part of the Islamic world in a strange and wonderful way. And so when the apartheid state was sort of trying to think about how to categorize people, it created categories that were just beyond black and white. It created categories like Malay, which was sort of meant to be a category for people who still identified with the East in some ways, but they were mixed race. And it also created the notion of coloredness, which is a category which didn't exist in South Africa before apartheid. And so those are the categories that in some ways are the most spectacular ones. But also there was politics and history involved. So some people laugh when I tell them that in South Africa, if you were Japanese, you were considered an honorary white person. But if you were Chinese, you were considered colored, because China was a communist country. And so the apartheid state couldn't possibly make Chinese people honorary white people because they were communists from their perspective. And so you would also get those kinds of expressions of the historical moment. So the Cold War was expressed in South Africa through the separation of the Asian community to sort of honorary whites and then colored Chinese people. And so from that perspective, really, in South Africa, the best way of talking about the social construction of race is that it was your neighbors who decided what your race, and the people you came into contact with on a daily basis. They are the people who, in some ways, under the system, were obligated to report you if you were falling into the wrong category or if you were trying to pass for something. The state really did not really have its own rigid classification. It was other people who would put you into the category in order to report you to the state. So as the conversation goes on, I can give you several of the examples of that kind of reporting, in which it was really your neighbors and the people around you who were the policemen who regulated racial categories.
Okay, thank you.
And for me, speaking specifically of a moment earlier than the South African moment that our colleague reported on, the whole thing starts with the beginning of the colonial transaction. It begins, my students right now are looking at encounters with difference in antiquity, and they are looking at people of African descent, dark-skinned, woolly hair, appearing in the pages of Herodotus without any of what today we would call racialization. Yeah. At what point does phenotypical difference become? At what point does it become a race? Yeah. Well, it becomes a race when there is a need for people to be racialized, and the people were first. There was first a need to be racialized with the colonial transaction that started in 1492, when the masters of the conquest and colonization discovered these vast territories. Yeah, they discovered primarily that they could master the natives. Yeah. Then they began to actually develop schemes of domination to dominate the natives, and to make the domination feasible. Yeah? We should remember that in any situation of domination, there has to be a moment when the vanquished accepts his or her condition of subservience. Yeah? If you don't have that, the domination has not succeeded, and you have a system which is untenable, because then you have to constantly, the dominant party has to be in a constant state of alert, in a state of war practically. Yeah. So you need to do something, and this is for the first time in human history, as far as I know, that has been an issue. Yeah? The Tainos were dehumanized, and they were dehumanized not only in that they were physically dominated by greater military might, by weapons of mass destruction, and by the diseases that the conquerors brought, right? That proved lethal to the indigenous populations. Yeah? But they also then proceeded to dominate their souls. And it is in the domination of their souls, in the attempt to make them feel deserving of the condition that they were in, right? It is there that you create the devalued other. And ancient domination never had a need to devalue the vanquished. Yeah? And so the domination begins, the dehumanization of the natives starts the process. Then when the workforce needs to be replenished with other sources of labor, the Africans are brought in, and then on their bodies, the process of dehumanization gets intensified. Yeah? And that actually, after that, I mean, you have memoranda by the King of France actually instructing the overseers in their overseas colonies exactly what to do and exactly what not to allow, so that the enslaved black will never get the slightest idea that he could ever be free or could in any way be the equal of his white master.
I think in responding to this question, what I'll do is actually piggyback on what was just said rather than repeating it, because in general, the historical processes that take place in the Dominican Republic and in northeastern Brazil, where I work, are very, very similar. So sugarcane production, which is primarily responsible for this sort of racialization, as you move on into the slave period and the industrial periods, sort of begins in Bahia, where I work, in the 16th century. And when Bahia loses its preeminence, places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic and Haiti begin to supply most of the world's goods. But what's most interesting about this, I think, is that this racialization process, it's okay, clearly I'm too large. It's been a problem my whole life. This racialization process occurs in very different ways around the world. So we're listening, Malay is a term in South Africa. To me, that's an interesting term because it probably describes a phenotype, but not really. It looks back to immigration from the Indian Ocean. And yet, in Brazil, where I work, we have categories like Alemão, German, but there are no Germans. It describes somebody who's sort of slightly lighter or may have blonde hair and yet have African features. So it's a system that doesn't trace back genealogically the way you're describing South Africa working. And so in terms of beginnings, I think that we can talk about not simply one, like clearly that moment of colonial domination in the Americas is a critical event for this hardening of difference which was typically seen as a sort of a series of gradients in the ancient world, and then has to be negotiated in new ways to differentiate conquerors and the supposedly conquered. And so that's where you get a hardening. You have courts deciding, is it 1/8 African blood, or 1/16 or 1/4, right? That's more US style. That never happened in Brazil. Brazil never had legally mandated discrimination. It had legally mandated slavery, but after slavery, in the post-emancipation period, there was no Jim Crow, there was the way there was in the United States. And yet, the system of racial separation was perhaps more intense than in the United States. And so that's a contradiction. It was clearly done in two very different ways in two different American countries, two huge industrial, agricultural democracies. And so really when we ask this question, when does racialization begin? Well, there are actually these series of steps that sometimes converge and sometimes diverge. Later on I'll talk about, I actually think that the Brazil and the United States are both converging and diverging in very interesting ways today, in ways that weren't true 20 years ago or 100 years ago.
Okay, thank you. And so what are the sort of tensions or difficulties that can arise when those with different understandings of racial norms are confronted with one another? And so if any personal experiences, what are personal experiences that you've had with racial labels being imposed upon you? Have you had any of those kinds of experiences in these spaces or in others? Or these, again, we're coming from the US context, which is one particular way of racialization, and you all are talking about some other spaces where other things are kind of operating. So what are the kind of tensions that can kind of develop?
Oh, is everyone?
In any order.
Well, I think one of the ways in which we tend to think about race and is that it is about the apportioning of exploitation, right? So the way that we think about the history of racism is it's about the creation of, or the suppression of the black skin as the kind of the skin that needs to be oppressed. But the other side of that, the flip side of that, is that race is also about the apportioning of privilege. And this is something that we often don't talk about because we're so focused on the liberation narrative about race, so liberating those who are oppressed by racial categories. And then we leave the category of the privileged unexamined. And the reason why that can be complicated is, so for example, in South Africa, one of the most touching narratives of a slave that I've read of is a very small excerpt about a slave woman who had red hair and about how her mistress would hack into her hair and cut it off because her red flaming, the way that the description in the transcript, in the Dutch transcript, is that she had this flaming red hair that used to confuse white men. And so when you have to think about that, well, what does it mean for white men to be confused? What that meant was they didn't think of her as a slave when they saw her in the street. And so this is why her mistress used to constantly hack off her hair and cut it off, is because when she was walking the streets, white men would just see a beautiful woman walking the street. They wouldn't think, oh, that's a slave woman. They would just think, hey, I could invite her home for dinner. And they would do exactly that. And so the mistress was upset by that fact, that they couldn't recognize her as a slave. And so cutting her hair off was a way of reminding her and then the rest of society that she was a slave. And so this sense of race as the apportioning of privilege means that, for example, just using personal experience, I was recently having a conversation with somebody, and they said to me, oh, do you know, we were talking about race in South Africa. They said, do you know, we are now called Sandton blacks. Now, I have to explain what that means. Sandton is a very posh suburb of South Africa, where all the beautiful malls and the beautiful hotels and the mansions, very upward. And so what has happened in South Africa is that when you have an accent, so from your perspective, I have a foreign accent, but from a South African perspective, I have what people call a Lani accent, or a semi-Lani accent. So that means you're a black person who has had a great education, and so you speak almost like a white person. Like you, if people close their eyes, they would think you, but they wouldn't think you were black. So this is the kind of idea. So in order to reintroduce race and then combine it with privilege, we now get called the Sandton blacks. So at parties, this is what the person was telling me, that at parties, white South African go, oh, that one is not really a formally disadvantaged black person. They are a Sandton black, which sort of is meant to mean that you're a black person, but you don't need any help because you're already privileged. So this idea that you're combining privilege and blackness together, but that because it's about blackness, you can't just call it privilege. You have to find the word black, you have to find a space for it. So I jokingly say to a friend, this friend that I'm talking, it sounds like a color of paint, like you go to the hardware store and say, I would like to paint my living room Sandton black, where can I find it? And so it's exactly that kind of thing, because now it's exactly the kind of thing that you can put on a marketing box or something and say, ooh, these shoes are for Sandton blacks, these clothes are for Sandton blacks. And so it's become a kind of marketing thing in South Africa. But in marketing, they say black diamonds. So as you can see, again, you keep having to use the word black because you're signifying the fact that diamonds are precious, right? They're very expensive, but there are special kinds of diamonds that are only worn by black people. And so those are the ones that you're going to sell. So in South Africa, when you walk into a place, people say, oh, that one is a black diamond. And what they mean is it's a wealthy, privileged black person. But you still have to acknowledge that they're black, because otherwise you would not be able to speak about them as simply a privileged human being. You have to put the privilege and the blackness together. So this is, again, the issue that I think in South Africa now is the most volatile one. It's how people not just talk about poor blacks, the blacks who bear the burden of being racialized, but actually the blacks who are, quote unquote, escaping that racial category, and in some ways how to keep putting them back into that category of blackness.
Okay. And for me, the apportionment of exploitation and privilege, that kind of the counterpoint between the two, both point to the construction of race as something that was intentional. It seems to me that when those people are making sure that they are, say, supervising, the degree of whiteness to which you might climb, and wishing that you reduce it. It seems to me that they're not constructing blackness there. They already have an idea of what the blackness is, and they want to make sure that you stay that it stays there. Yeah, and then there's a history that created that, right? So what we see in the case of the French Antilles, it's very clear that there was actually specific policies to make sure that even the wealthy mulattoes and the blacks, who themselves owned plantations in the 18th century, that they had to, the state, right, in the colony had to find a way to differentiate between them and the Grand Blanc, and the real whites, yeah. And so there were all kinds of prohibitions about things that they could not wear in public, yeah, about a number of demeaning things, right. In other words, strategies to keep those people in their place, yeah. And then the history of how the place came to be is something that I'm interested in. Now, in terms of the different experiences of race, I think it's hugely important to be aware of differing experiences. I feel that I came to this country in 1973, yeah, a time when we just, we're still in the middle of the struggles, pretty much, of the civil rights movement, right? There was much Negrophobia around. Yeah, I actually believe that I was not crushed by the Negrophobia around, because much of it I did not recognize, did not understand. I could not decode the things. Like when I'm in Canarsie, Brooklyn, and I see a police officer, a police car rushes by me, speeds up as I'm trying to cross the street with the intention of doing me harm, right? And then give me the finger when I narrowly escape, right? Right. I just saw a mean person. I just saw mean people, right? And that may have to do with the fact that where I come from, the person doing you harm could be your color. Yeah? Even though there is, white supremacy exists as a value in the Dominican Republic, and Negrophobia is considerably widespread, right? Still, there is something, you might say, liberating about the fact that you can see human depravity in people of all kinds of skin colors. And so when I told Yael my experience in the subway when I was sitting, doing my own thing, and then this white woman who stands in front of me and actually begins lashing things out of me, insulting me in all kinds of. She called me anything but a child of God. Let's put it that way, right? And then I said, I didn't know what was happening. I considered possibly there might be a racial moment, but I did not settle for it. So I moved away. Then a white man, a little bit older than me, took the place I had vacated, and then she began doing this same thing to that man, right? And I said, "Gee, how lucky that I did not jump did not jump to a racial explanation of that." And I actually believe that one of the things that we will do one day, if we actually reach that post-racial moment, is that we'll be able to see the entire range of human depravity. That is not all reducible to just race, yeah. And so I'll stop there for now.
Wow. Well, again, I would like to piggyback and ask a question. The story that we just heard, in many ways, sums up to me how race works and how difficult it is to talk about its beginnings and ends. Because, yes, there was a lot of human depravity there. But that depravity could shift simply who's in front of that woman. Right? And so the thing about race is that Barbara Fields, who's a historian of North American slavery, calls it a promiscuous critter. Right? It shapeshifts in ways that allows it to glom onto and to pick up existing spheres of discrimination. So you can't talk about race without class and gender and sexuality, right? But the meaning of race changes according to one's sexuality, according to one's gender. And that calculation as to what's happening, how am I being discriminated against, just can't be made without thinking through these sort of other hierarchies in any society. And so I would actually say to you that sort of like the way that I understand race, the way that I define it in my own thinking, is that it's a relationship between the exterior and the interior. And it's the way that a bundle of qualities, and that bundle of qualities can shift across any society, point to who you ostensibly really are inside. So in other words, looking at somebody's hair tells you whether or not they're lazy or not. supposedly, or whether they're sexually promiscuous, or whether they're good with money or not, or whether they can dance in certain ways or can't, right? These are the kind of cultural logics that seem to ring a bell from your expressions, right? But shift so much across. And so this is actually, I wanted to ask a question. So what I'm hearing, there's an understood to be a black way of speaking in South Africa. Now, in Brazil where I work, and in the US we know that there is, right? In Brazil where I work, there is no identified, recognizably black way of speaking, and 80% of the city is of African descent and suffers very, very harsh discrimination and knows that. And yet there's no talk about black Portuguese. It's just, I mean, there's African influences on Portuguese, but there's no talk. So I'm wondering, in the DR, is there is there an elite Spanish and a working class Spanish? Is there an
Well, first of all, there's in the Dominican Republic, what we have is a late recognition of the country's and the culture's Caribbeanness. Yeah? For ages, the country thought of itself, well, that is the intellectual elites of the country, right? Constructed a narrative of national culture and identity that made us all the descendants of not of the indigenous population, not of the enslaved Africans who were brought to do the labor of building the society, right, and to create the wealth, but the direct descendants of the conquerors. Yeah? It's an amazing thing, because the fact is, at one point, people do believe that is true, irrespective of their own phenotype. Yeah. I mean, I tell the story of the high school history textbook, in which this historian is repeating the old narrative of the Haitian unification period. You know, the oppression, the oppression that the Dominican Republic suffered. There was no Dominican Republic when the unification happened, right? The Dominican Republic is born as a result of a separatist movement from Haitian sovereignty. Yeah, but people speak of the unification period from 1821 to 1844 as a bad period in the history of the country. And this historian, whom I had to read in high school, actually has a chapter in which he describes the ways in which that period damaged the Dominican Republic. And one of them was the Africanization of the population. Yeah? Still in the 1980s, you have Joaquin Balaguer speaking of explaining Dominican underdevelopment as a result of Africanization. Yeah? You can't have that if you begin with a recognition of yourself as a Caribbean country. Yeah? When all of the countries in the Caribbean had their great awakening, right? The intellectual history in the Caribbean is actually a response to the defamation. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Whereas in the Dominican Republic, the defamation is perpetrated by the intellectual elites. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Against its own people. Yeah? And so we don't have a way of speaking. We say that we speak badly. We say that we as a people, as a nation, speak Spanish badly, and we admire the way Colombians speak it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, not the Colombians from Cartagena.
No. No.
Can I just add a quick point there that, again, also to do with this whole theme that I've decided to talk on privilege. In South Africa, it's not just about a black way of speaking, but it's that even white South Africans, there is an English way. So as I say, the word Lani, like when people say it in South Africa, they mean you went to a particular school in a particular suburb, and it's a very specific kind of, so in South Africa we have a lot of English speaking Protestant private schools where a lot of young kids go black, white, and so if you have that accent from those schools, then people say that you're Lani, or in the townships they use the term Model C. So in South Africa there's even a song that uses the word Model C. So people will say you're a Model C, meaning you are from a particular kind of schooling, a particular kind of background, and therefore you've ended up with a particular kind of accent. And so even within the white community itself, you can almost tell if you close your eyes who is the person who's Afrikaans, who is the person who's English, because the accent. So it's in South Africa, the best way of describing it is it's an echo of the British Empire, that the British Empire made people aspire to speak proper. And so the more proper you speak, the more that you are considered to be of the higher echelons of society, and therefore privileged in some way.
And a little detail on John's question. The Dominican way of speaking, actually, to show that you are really educated, up until quite recently, you spoke with a theta. You spoke with you say corazón instead of the Caribbean, Dominican, Latin American corazón, right? Because that's that's how the tribute to the master, right? And we have in the Dominican Republic we have this zona colonial, the colonial zone in the capital city of Santo Domingo, which is actually an effort, tons of money invested in actually recreating what the city was like when when the Spanish Don Diego Colón was there, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of cult of the Spanish ancestry, which is actually crazy because it has no bearing on the population at all. But somehow the political elites have managed to get away with it for generations upon generations.
Okay. And so also, so I'm thinking, we're talking a lot about hierarchies here, so hierarchies of the class and race, but do we see a convergence of sort of these racialized hierarchies? And at some point they were quite different, some places were similar. John was mentioning that that there's a similarity between what's going on in Brazil and what's happened in the Dominican Republic. Do we see a sort of convergence of these various systems now? And also, what do you think is the future of race? Are we thinking that the post-racist society is possible moving forward?
If I could say very quickly, just one of the most interesting things to come of this is, so for example, the idea that somebody would speak with a Spanish accent in the Dominican Republic, nobody would ever speak with a Portuguese accent in Brazil, right? The colonial master is not somebody to be emulated. In fact, this denial, I mean, what I understand, this denial of indigenous roots and African roots through an emphasis on brownness, on a national brownness, whereby, oh sure, we're slightly damaged by this, but we're damaged as one single group where there is ostensibly no discrimination, is what you see in Brazil right now. But that colonial damage in Brazil has been re-signified, so that what happens is that Brazilians would say, okay, I have African descent, but this makes me better than the European master, the colonial master. But what the Brazilian black movement has pointed out is that in doing that move, you're actually denying Africanness, you're denying blackness. And so the move right now in Brazil is to say, okay, how can we get beyond this ostensible non-racialism, to which the US is supposedly moving, but it's not, right? How can we get beyond that in a way that actually allows us to recognize the forms of discrimination that exist in our society? So I see here actually a divergence from the Dominican Republic. And one of the places that Brazilians are looking to is the US and the US civil rights struggle. So there's an argument in Brazil that rather than saying we're all a little bit African and we've suffered because of that, but we made it better, to now say, you know what, we in fact we're going to use US style categories, and we're going to use that to recognize that we're black and we're being discriminated against on the basis of our skin color.
Yeah. I was very impressed when I was studying Portuguese Brazilian literature, and I learned that Brazil actually had a national spelling. Brazilian has its own spelling that differs from Portuguese. So that, I was very impressed by that. A future to race. In order for us to be able to imagine a future to race, let's say a post-racial future, yeah, we would need to have two things. Yeah, one, an ability and a willingness to go back to the beginning, yeah, to the genesis of the bloody thing, yeah, to see the nastiness that was perpetrated, yeah, and to recognize that as a tragic beginning to all of the societies of the hemisphere, yeah. Recognize that as a tragic beginning, not as something that we glorify in monuments, in statues that celebrate the colonial period, right? Like the way Columbus statues pollute every city, in the nation today. Yeah, we need to do that. Then we also need to look at a far future, a future that is remote in the past, and we cannot do that right now. I mean, the university is not able to do it. Intellectuals are not able to do it. Politicians are not able to do it. Yeah, business is not able to, because all of them are strapped for cash, and they need the corporations. They need politicians need the funding. Yeah, so they can only think in terms of the next day. They cannot think long future. Long future, I think, is in the hands right now of people who are in the faith community. Yeah, and people who are interfaith. Yeah. People who recognize that the real religious experience is inherently interfaith, yeah, and who are able to say, like Desmond Tutu, God is not a Christian, yeah, meaning you can't say that God created us and at the same time He chose to align with one portion of us against the others. That sounds like stupid, yeah, and so my faith now is in enlightened voices from the faith community.
Okay. I would think that there are two moments that I think we need to revisit if we want to talk about race now. The first one is decolonization. And in America, I think people tend to forget what a momentous occasion that was for Africans. Because in some ways, for the African continent, decolonization broke that what Hegel had called the dialectic, that sort of the bind of power and whiteness and privilege. And we need to go back to some of those moments and think about why it is that decolonization was not complete. And then the second moment is the Cold War, because the Cold War was one of the few periods in which black, brown, yellow people, green people were united against a single enemy, in which capitalism was seen as the enemy, in which the Western world was seen as the enemy. And even though people were not necessarily aligning themselves with the Soviet Union, there was a sense of solidarity. And that sense of solidarity across the racial categories that were created by colonialism was very important. And again, it's another moment that in some ways has been lost. And I think if we want to talk about post-racism, those are the two moments that we have to revisit and ask ourselves, well, why didn't those moments yield the kind of emancipation from race that we had hoped for?
2 seconds. 2 seconds. Just so that my thought is complete. The reason why we need to look at the long future and have people who are able to have a long view of the future is because we need people who are able to think, to have a vision of the future based on the enhancement of social relations. Not in terms of technological development, not in terms of making cars that speed up, that can acquire 1,000 miles within the distance of a block, right? But can we treat one another decently? Yeah, and we need people who are able to think that. And right now, I don't see anywhere where we can have that except in the faith community, especially those interfaith voices.
Okay. And so, thank you so much for those wonderful responses. We're going to move now into dialogue groups, and I don't know who. Okay.
No problem. Hi, everyone. So I think our speakers are doing a fantastic job, but I want to give us all the opportunity to discuss what we're hearing.
Okay, so we're going to start with the first question is racism based upon physical traits or the environment? What are we thinking?
Racism is not caused by physical traits. Racism is not caused by the environment. Racism is caused by social relations and the different and power differentials or the struggle for power in social relations.
Very quickly, physical difference means absolutely nothing unless one assigns value to it, and social relations assign value to that. Otherwise, we don't even notice differences between people.
I would add to that and say that it's confusing to talk about the cause of racism, because one of the reasons why that's difficult is that whenever people discuss race, it is always the victims who somehow have to bring the conversation to a head. It is never the people who are the racists. And so it's always the victims who are talking about experiencing racism. So there's a very big difference between the experience of the racism and the expression of racism. And the two people who do those things are not normally the same person. So a person cannot both experience racism and express racism at the same time. It tends to be two different people. And so it tends to be the case that we talk a lot to people who experience racism, but we don't talk to the people who express racism and say, we never ask people, well, why are you racist? Why does this make you feel uncomfortable? Why does difference make you feel uncomfortable? We are always in some ways trying to counsel the victims. And I think sometimes we need to change the conversation around and ask the opposite question. Rather than asking questions about the experience of racism, ask questions about the expression of racism.
Okay. And thinking about these differences between the expressor and those who experience racism, in conversations of race, do we homogenize whiteness while identifying gradations of people of color?
Yes. In the autobiography of Malcolm X, there is, I believe it is in the introduction by Alex Haley. Haley tells the story of the time when he went to pick up Malcolm at the airport, and as they were getting together, coming in, they saw a European family coming in, and then Malcolm pointed to the children and says, very soon they're going to discover that they're white, and they're going to hate us too. So basically, we know that Italians that Italians moved into whiteness. We know that Eastern European, the Jews moved into whiteness, right? We know that the Irish moved into whiteness. And as I told my class jokingly the other day, it's hard for me to imagine anybody whiter than the Irish, yet they had to climb into whiteness, So yes, we tend to homogenize, and the homogenization is done as a result of these, the cost or the benefits of whiteness, in a sense. Yeah.
Okay. And so, is there a similarity between racism in places such as Europe, Asia, and Africa compared to the Americas, outside of colonialism? Are there some distinctions that you kind of see across hemispheres almost?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of a joke, because in South Africa at the moment, everyone's obsessed with the American term yellow bone. So in South Africa, you now hear people describe other people as a yellow bone. They go, oh, such and such a person is a yellow bone. But the funny part about it is that how did the term enter the vocabulary? It entered the vocabulary through the scandal of a trade unionist who was having an affair with a younger member of his staff. And when he was caught, in his confession, he said, she was my yellow bone. And so in South Africa now, everyone's completely obsessed with this idea. So at some level, there is this transference of vocabulary. But then there's also the transference of aesthetics, because there's a way in which being black is there's sort of a certain kind of look that gets transferred around the world. So, for example, when you drive in Hillbrow, which is part of the inner city of Johannesburg, you will see images of Rihanna, or you'll see images of Beyonce, but other kinds of blackness are not represented in that visual way. There's a kind of aspirational blackness in which people say, I want to be like that person. And I think that is becoming globalized in very, very interesting ways. And so there's an element or a portion of American popular culture which in the rest of the world is seen as black culture and is seen as aspirational, that people want to be part of that community. And it is really about race, because even in America, those people who rise to the top, who become the representation of this culture, are select. They don't represent the majority of African Americans.
And actually, another question that was brought up is about the media, and so how the media plays into and sort of reinforces this construction of race. And so you've given some examples, but are there, in terms of in other spaces, do we see that as well?
Well, there's much literature, for instance, on the representation of Latinos in the media, representation of blacks in the media. I would even say representations of blackness in the faculty of universities. University conversations. Like, why is it that when there's some event, some important event, let's say the inauguration of a particular chancellor, there's a round table, like some I've seen in the last years at Syracuse University, the diversity point is assigned to the person of color, right? As if somehow it is, or the diversity classes gets filled up by minority students, and so there is that very problematic thing there. Yeah.
Just very quickly, as an ethnographer, I always look at who gets assigned what stories on New York News. It's interesting, the identity of the reporter and where they're asked to go.
Okay. The next question is, how is exceptionalism used as a norm across cultures? And I would think that actually, again, it goes back somewhat to what Dr. Mokoena is saying about these particular individuals that are sort of heightened and put up. But
well, again, I'm gonna pick an example, going back to, say, for example, hair, which is one of the great contested terrains of race. In a single family, you could have someone with very curly hair and someone with very straight hair. And when you ask people what that feels like to be in that kind of family, one of the things that people point out is how it is that when you have very straight, fine hair, you are always almost told immediately who you must marry in advance of you even meeting that person. People say, don't go darker, you must only go lighter. And so the kind of idea,
improving the race.
Right, the kind of idea that certain kinds of looks are in themselves a signifier that you should be in a particular category or you should be climbing a particular social ladder. And that, even, as I say, within one family, one person could be encouraged to climb that social ladder, and then the other person or the other people within the family not. So that's an example of exceptionalism. But another way is actually even the recognition of brilliance. So with some of my friends, we often talk about how difficult it is often for people of color to simply be acknowledged as having worked hard for certain things. There is now a narrative in which people say to people of color, oh wow, you've won this award, it must be because of affirmative action. And you say, but I've worked for it. I didn't just show up and say, hey, I'm black, give me the award. I worked for it, I earned it. And so there's a way in which it's often very difficult for people to acknowledge that people of color have done well. So just this morning I was listening to my favorite program on WNYC, and the person who was being interviewed is a professor of communications, and he was being asked about Barack Obama's policies on the internet. And the first thing he said that came out of his mouth is, well, Barack Obama has done a lot of wrong things. And I found myself shouting at the radio saying, Barack Obama passed a piece of legislation reforming the American healthcare. Bill Clinton couldn't do it, and he did it. But when people speak about him, the first thing they enumerate are his failures. And you say, how can you call him a failure when even if there are many prime ministers, when you read history, who did nothing in their entire tenure as prime minister or president? They did nothing. Nobody remembers them, but nobody will call them failures. But this man, immediately people start, and then he goes on rambling like, well, I don't want to talk. And I'm thinking, just stop right there. You've called the man a failure, and I'm upset already because you just cannot. And it's so difficult for people to look at a person of color and shake your hand and say, you've done well, you deserve this. And sometimes that's all people of color want to hear. They want to be acknowledged for having done something exceptional. But again, the reverse racism, if I score a hoop on the basketball court, oh yeah, of course that's expected of you to do that.
Natural ability.
Yeah, that's natural ability. But if you do something that people aren't expecting a person of color to succeed in, then it's sort of begrudging. It's like you have to drag it out of people to acknowledge that what you've achieved is exceptional. To use that word and say what you've done is exceptional. I think Barack Obama has been an exceptional president. And I will say it, I'll say it over, whatever his faults, he's been an exceptional president precisely because he's done what presidents do. He wins some, he loses some. And every president has had that problem. He's not the first one.
When you get crucified, when you go back to Johannesburg, when you defend Barack Obama, I mean, you may be crucified.
Well, yes, obviously from an African perspective,
Yes.
we can say, yeah, well, you could have done more. You could have just said, Kenya, here's 5 billion. But yes.
That reminds me of your example reminds me of the latest Oscar nonsense.
Right.
And African Americans are expected to sing and to entertain, therefore you can get an award in
For the singing.
and music category.
Right.
But overall, for this great woman to have done
Exactly.
a remarkable job
Yes.
and to not even get recognized for the lead actor for just nominating, acknowledgement. You know,
Exactly.
it was an award, just
Right.
acknowledgement.
Exactly.
You
It's
know?
true. It's
And
true.
that just didn't happen.
Right. I mean, a friend of mine and I watched American Sniper together, and at the end we were like, this film was nominated? This film was nominated? And we couldn't believe it. We were like, what the hell was that about? My friend was so upset. She was like, this is the most ridiculous film I've watched this year. Why did you? So we had this whole conversation, and Clint Eastwood was nominated several times for American Sniper. And Selma, yeah, but those are all the issues where you just think, just saying you've done well. I don't need the award. I just need you to say you've done well.
But I think if you want any further evidence of how masterfully well Barack Obama has done his job, has been his success at not being provoked by the insults. You know, I think 8 years of just staying the course there, no matter what folks say, no matter what people shout from during the State of the Union address. It's amazing. The exceptionalism also, I think, is often connected with a tendency on our part to not be sufficiently intersectional. We actually think that to value somebody, that we can only value somebody when the person is sort of displaying the vestment of success at high levels. Yeah, but we can actually, there is regular people surviving on a daily basis, doing the right thing, supporting their kids, taking the kids to school, right, and surviving at that. And quite often we don't see that because we have, we are educated on the lives of the rich and famous, and that's what we think. That's what we see as history, as the makers of history. We don't see the people actually to go to the street. Open admissions in CUNY, when it existed, did not come about as a result of the great intellects. Right? Was people taking to the streets? Yeah, and that quite often that gets lost, except for people who want to do social history. What's his name? Howard. The famous social history of the United States.
Zinn.
Howard Zinn, yeah. In the Dominican Republic, for instance, we have this, I think, evocative case of Jose Francisco Peña Gomez. Man, you can't get any blacker than that, yeah. And he is the child of Haitian parents. He's a survivor of the genocide that took place in 1937. He was rescued and adopted by a Dominican family. Through thick and thin, managed to move up in life and became the most popular, most liked Dominican politician in the entire 20th century. Yeah, people followed him when he was at the top of his power. The people who adored him, right, and followed him around. But when he died and disappeared, they went back to being anti-Haitian. Yeah, because this was not a Haitian. This was Peña Gómez. You know, and that thing about, because ultimately I think what we need to think of is, what are we doing to people's humanity? Yeah, I mean, what is that racism does, right? Racism is an app, right, that gets installed in us, yeah, which interferes with our ability to recognize our visage in the visage of the other, right? Yeah, and so that inability to recognize the humanity of the other, that's the core, right? It's a form of knowledge, a way of knowledge that has that capacity, yeah? Which is why it is possible to commit racial violence in large scale without feeling guilty, yeah? And so ultimately it's about the humanity. The humanity does not exist in one class level only, irrespective of the race or the ethnicity of the people involved, yeah? So along with anti-racism, there should also be an ambition to sort of fight whatever classism is informing our view of the world.
If I could just add something very quickly on that, a different interpretation of exceptionalism is one of the things that's most pronounced is that when you speak to New Yorkers, they talk about the intense racism in the South. We know what a story that is, right? I mean, New York is as intensely, if not more intensely, racist. But it seems that race oftentimes moves alongside an effort by certain groups and certain people to extract themselves. And I'm not speaking about skin color, I'm speaking about things like temporality, right? So this is one reason that I often find it so difficult to talk about when race begins. Because if you look to, say, Brazilian history, and you speak to people who are talking to you in 1889, 1890, soon after the birth of the nation and emancipation, they'll talk about this sort of new beginning and lack of racism. And yet what we see is a reinstantiation of the racism. So the claiming of exceptionality, which is absolutely important to any community establishing its identity, exceptionalism, oftentimes produces in itself a veiling which hides what's actually going on racially. And actually I think what you just said, it's very important, this metaphor of the app, I've never thought of that, but we have to think about forms of modern knowledge and how they produce race. So like when you think about race, rather than looking at the most blatant examples of racism, why don't you think about the structure of the North American census or the importance of the dialectic to Western philosophy? Right? The dialectic arises in a relationship between master and slave, supposedly, right? People have traced this back to Hegel's reading of what's happening in the Caribbean around the Haitian Revolution, right? So, I guess what I'm saying here is this is especially true of, say, of white liberals, right? Is this, oh, that's not me. That's what, New York. That's what white working class people do in Alabama, not what we do in Nassau County or Westchester. And I think that that's a really important facet of exceptionalism that we need to think about, which is very different from what we were just talking about.
And yet those the statistics on the stop and frisk horror that the former mayor insisted on, yeah, showed overwhelmingly, right, the people who stopped and frisked were people of color, right? And overwhelmingly they were wrong, yeah, numerically. When asked about this disparity, there was a spokesperson from the police who said, well, it is not designed to be racist, it just works out that way. Because in fact it's the app operating. It's no intentionality. Racism ceases to be intentional. Yeah, I believe actually that if you are an intentional racist, you are closer to overcoming it than if you are not.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
And so in terms of thinking about personal experiences, did racialization to some extent influence who you all are today? Did it motivate you or did it become an obstacle, have you found?
Well, I'll start. I never really thought of myself as black until, and I grew up in apartheid South Africa, but I just happened to have grown up in boarding school, and I went to all black boarding school. So in my mind, everyone who was brilliant that I knew was black. So my grandmother's a dressmaker, and she used to create all these beautiful dresses. So in my mind, there was never any sense of black inferiority. And the first time I experienced that was I got a scholarship to study A-levels in England. And the very first day, so I'll give you this as a little story, the very first day of this, and this is a very posh private school in England. So I'm walking towards chapel in the morning, and the headmaster, because the school was 99% black, white, so he sort of knew who the black kids were. So he walks up to me and he says, "Oh, you must be the new girl from South Africa." And I say, "Yes." And he says, "Oh, how do you like our school?" And I say, "It's great." And I said, "But the students are a bit wasteful, so I'm a bit concerned about that." Or something, I say something like that. And the headmaster gets into chapel and gets up to make his, first day of school speech. And then at the end of the speech, he stands up and he goes, "The new girl from South Africa." And obviously, I'm like the only black person in this room full of white. They all turn and look to me. And he says, "She has said that we are wasteful. I think we should get up and observe a moment's silence for those who have less than we do." And so the entire school stands up, and they're meant to have their eyes closed to observe this moment's silence, but they're all looking at me like. So afterwards, everybody came up to me. The teachers, "What did you say to the headmaster? What did you say to the headmaster?" And for the first time, I suddenly thought, oh gosh, I am representing all of black people at this very moment in time, because for most of the people at that school, I was the only black person that they were ever probably going to socialize with, ever. And so that moment was the moment of sort of my beginning. And so to end the moment, just to give you a sense of how it comes full circle, on my very last day of school, one of my classmates walks up to me, shakes my hand and says, "It was good to meet a communist in the flesh." So I went from being the black girl
To the
communist.
It's like Barack Obama.
So for me, that was the first kind of true experience of what it feels like to be black in an unfamiliar surrounding where there are no black people. So the town that the school was in, Cheltenham, there were like 2 black people. I mean, it was a kind of place where when you try and go and find hair products at the pharmacy, you're walking around and other black people are coming up to you like, "Where do I do my hair?" That kind of place where your face is just, it stands out when you're traveling with the school on a school bus. Everyone's looking at you, "What are you doing with all these white people," etc., etc. So for me, that was the first experience, but it was really the sort of arc of going from black to communism that I'm still puzzling over.
Okay, thank you.
For me, I think that my most decisive encounter with race as a concern comes not so much from the lived experience of a childhood in the Dominican Republic, and then the latter half of my adolescence, and then from then onward in the United States, living in the United States. It's not so much the lived experience as the academic experience. In my studies, I was my encounter with race in the texts of the great books, the great minds of the Western world, right? And for instance, finding in Hegel the first book of the first chapter in the philosophy lessons on the lectures on the philosophy of history, and his dismissal of Africa, especially especially Negroid Africa, right? From the removing it from the narrative of history, yeah, because of the things that those people lacked, yeah. And then my realizing, at the time I respected myself enough to actually recognize that I had the qualities that Hegel was saying that blacks did not have, and I said, then he's lying, right? So you mean that you could be a great thinker and lie, and that the lie will not cause you to suffer discredit, right? Or when I encountered the the blacks in the notes on the state of Virginia, of Jefferson, and the blacks, and then I began to think of, why is it that everyone needs to do a chapter or a section on the vilification of blacks? There's got to be something that somebody is trying to hide, as like, why not just one said it, we all agree, so why keep saying it? Huh? But intellectual history is drenched, right, with the juice of negrophobia, and that actually was something that intrigued me tremendously. And I actually believe that today, when we look at one of the things that my work does now, or is trying to do now, is to try to establish a parallel between the thought and the words of the great minds and those of the people on the street, the uneducated on the street, the racist uneducated on the street, and the great mind, and then to find those points at which they are at the same level. And how come they retain their greatness? Yeah, if they operate at that level. And then it occurred to me that it's not that they are not great, but that when they come to race, something happens to their thought processes which prevents them from achieving the clarity, the insight, the sophistication that they display in the subjects that are of their expertise. Yeah. So to me, it became very clear that race is really a very important thing, and something worth pursuing in several books. Yeah.
Well, let's see. It's clear that I'm not black, right?
Are you sure?
Is it?
Well, it is today. Perhaps it wasn't 600 years ago when my grandfather was Irish arriving here. But that's perhaps, there was a phrase that came across this, the enhancement of social relations. And I guess what I will do is my final comment will be on that. I grew up in the suburbs of New York, and I have a very, very clear memory of, it was quite amazing, the town, it was almost all white. But those who lived on the wrong side of the railroad tracks, and this is not me saying, oh my gosh, I know what it's like to be black. That's why I started out by saying it's clear that I'm not. That's a dangerous discourse, and one that I will not participate in. Those who lived on the wrong side of the tracks and those who were on the basketball team were overwhelmingly Irish. And so I found myself as this 6'6" Irish American kid who everybody wanted to play basketball, but I wanted to take AP history, being classified in the wrong way, right? And things would happen. I would walk into my AP class, and I had one teacher who would always say to me, say, Colin, at the beginning of every year in the honors class, he'd say, Collins, what the hell are you doing here? The Irish don't come to honors classes. And it was in fact true that they didn't. They were in the shop classes. And we know this structural relationship. It's a common structural relationship across the United States, across the Americas, perhaps across the world. It's not typically about today, the Irish being in shop class, but it was in this case. Well, why am I recounting this? Because I found that when I went to college, if I put on a suit and tie, I could easily be confused with the graduate of, I don't know, George Bush's roommate at Andover, right? How you speak, what you're wearing. In other words, my whiteness shifted in that movement. And we were talking as faculty about how one gains authority in classrooms here at Queens College. I know full well that as a white man, I have to do less oftentimes to gain the attention of you, our students, than do some of my colleagues. And so when I'm speaking to you about enhancement of social relations, what I'm asking is that we all open up to these, at times, ridiculous examples that can be abused, but examples that are very telling as to the structures that we're all enmeshed in. But the point was made that oftentimes those who are dominant in those structures, they're completely invisible. But it's that enhancement of, so my own experience in this relatively minor discrimination compared to what many people in the world face, I think opened me to enhancing my vision of how power courses across the room. And I think that that's the role that all of us need to get out of this.
Okay. And actually, I have my own question. I think I'm taking liberty here. And just to kind of close, but how can we fight racism without dismissing the realities of the socially constructed racial hierarchies, or further reify race? So how do we do that? Because I think, we're talking about saying, people can be very dismissive and say like, oh, race is only a social construct, so nah, and that doesn't deal with the realities of race, It only deals with the biological fiction, but not the social reality. But then also, but not make race very real in a way that it technically isn't. So, how do we fight racism given these two things?
I'll start again. I used to joke in South Africa and say, I'll know that racism is dead when I see a white woman with a mop scrubbing the floors and sweating away like black workers. In South Africa, if you want to see somebody work, then it's normally a black person. It's never. So that's the joke I used to make. And what that refers to is the fact that really what is most pernicious about racism is that it comes with this class bias, that it tends to be that the poorest people, the most disadvantaged people, also tend to be dark-skinned people. And so the first thing to do is to break that association between race and class. And one of the ways of doing that, and I think in the world that we live in now, where people are already assuming that we live in a post-racial world, people tend to think of it as simply about dismantling the discourse, as it were, that once we've done with the discourse of race, then we'll be done with racism. And I tend to oppose that. I think you need to do practical things. So one of the words that I normally use is the word invest, because people understand the word invest, because it involves a lot of money. And when you say, oh, we need to have programs, we need to do this, people think, oh, well, if I just, take my change in when I'm sitting in an airplane and put it in an envelope and send it to Africa, then I've done my bit. And to contribute to the program, to get with the program. So the way that I normally put it is we need to invest in black lives. We need to invest in giving, number one, young black people an experience of what it feels like in some ways to be on the other side. And I'm speaking again from experience. I did not take, even though I knew when I was young that I was good at what I did, I didn't really take myself seriously as a thinker, as a human being, until I was in situations where my teachers would say, oh, you're going to Oxford. And I would look around and think, that dumbass is going to Oxford. He's going to Oxford and I'm not. So it wasn't until I was confronted with a situation in which I could look at other people and think, how come he can go to Oxford? How come he can be told? Because this is one of the joys of privilege. It's that other people tell you that you are privileged. You don't even have to feel privileged. You get told, if you do well, you're going to Oxford, you're going to Cambridge. And I can remember thinking, when I was young, nobody would ever say that to me. Nobody would ever look at me and say, oh, you could end up at Oxford or Cambridge. And I think, well, why is that? And another example that I'll give you, at my school, all the kids would take a test. And at the end of the test, the company that did this test would literally give them a booklet, giving them all the career options. And I remember opening one person's booklet, And on top of the booklet, the number one thing was diplomat. And I can remember looking at that thinking, nobody would ever have said to me, you could be a diplomat when you grow up. And yet here is this kid in England who just took a test, and the test tells him or her that she could be a diplomat. And I think those are the ways in which we can begin to destroy racism. We need to invest in changing the social structure that creates this chain in which poverty breeds poverty. There's nothing more tragic than watching a kid with loads of potential and no investor, no person to hold that kid by the hand and say, I don't care how much you scream and kick. Because when we are young, we often have no idea about our future. We need somebody to hold us by the hand and say, I don't care how much you scream and kick. I am taking you out of the situation that you're in, and I'm going to put you in a different situation, and I'm going to make you feel what it feels like to be taken seriously. So it's not about anything to do with race as such. It's about someone taking you seriously enough to invest in your future and to give you that sense that your future is worthwhile and that you can do it like everybody else. And as I say, I went to a school with very dumb English kids, but they were always getting told they were brilliant. And I used to just sit there and be amazed and be like, how can these people all be destined for great things? And there's so many black kids who are much more talented than these people, and they don't get told that they are destined for great things. So that's how I would destroy, if I ruled the world.
Well, Si?
Sorry, I'm a visitor here, and racism is a deep, dark, violent, painful subject, but it's being discussed here very softly, I think, maybe for lots of reasons, and maybe that's okay. That's not my point is not to attack that. But when Hlonipha mentioned that story about being the only black person in the white school in Cheltenham, and this pupil calling you a communist, it put me in mind of the really some of the deepest, darkest days of South African apartheid, when I think it was Forster who spoke about communism of the mind. Remember, that was a thing. I mean, that was a thing when I was coming of age. It's communism of the mind. And I'm just putting in mind of the one aspect of racism that I don't know that has been explicitly discussed, and that is this kind of visceral, there's a kind of visceral racism. There's all kinds of racisms, but there is also undeniably, and there has always been, a visceral kind. And this conflation of black or otherness or black with communism. Communism also, because it also was the object and the target of a kind of visceral racism. It was a sort of racist category all on its own in a certain context. And I think that sort of explained that otherwise completely bizarre comic. But anyway, my observation was just that, that just to just remember the really poisonous and violent nature that sort of motivates racist sentiment or feeling and acts and things. This has nothing to do with ideas or logic or anything else.
Do you mind if I just a quick response to that? Is that I think that all racism is visceral, because all racism is based on the assumption that people make that they know something about the world that others don't know. This is what, in some ways, racists always believe. So when you read racist texts, people say, I know the blacks. I mean, this is racists often think that they are entitled to being racist because they have this knowledge. I know the Jews, I know the blacks. When they do this, this is what they're thinking. When they do this, this is what they're planning. And so it is always based on that visceral, but also this idea that you have some kind of privileged knowledge of the other, that therefore you can speak on the other's behalf because you have that privileged knowledge. And it is the intellectualization of that visceral racism that is often problematic, that is often most tenacious, because then it institutionalizes itself. And that's the part of it that most of us experience. We never experience that gut feeling where somebody's sitting there and they feel the anxiety when they're in the presence of somebody of another culture. We often just experience the institutional expression of that visceral hatred of other human beings. And personally, I think that anybody who can read and write has no excuse to be a racist, because you can find all the evidence that would tell you shouldn't be a racist.
May I
So
just...
you choose, out of all of the evidence that's available in the world, you always choose the evidence that supports your racial ideology.
May I disagree just partially?
Right.
What I'm hearing you saying is that there's a visceral racism which is then sort of funneled up through the structures of knowledge that we live by. And I guess, I don't know if I'm misrepresenting what you've said, but if I could just say,
Yeah.
my way of seeing it is actually that there are modern forms of knowledge
Yeah.
that are inherently racist. That they come out of the colonizing experience and they pass as objective, but they're not objective at all. And hidden within them are all sorts of exclusions within the rights of man, general man. And so rather than thinking that it's that like if we take social constructivism very seriously, then the social construction of our forms of knowledge go back down to produce what's supposedly inside of us. So I don't think that people are viscerally racist. I don't think that people are viscerally afraid of those who look different. I don't think they even see, as we talked about children, that people are different. But that we are all entrapped in a university like this one, how wonderful it is, but we're entrapped in traditions of the production of knowledge that generate what passes as the visceral, what passes as the biological, what passes as the essentially human. But it's not essentially human, and we don't know anything beyond that. It's just slightly different.
And briefly, because we only have this room until a few more minutes, yeah? So, we should be wrapping up right now. So, I am, for me, I'm less interested in working with the racists than I am with working with the victims of racism. What I'm interested in is having people who can be exposed to racism and yet not be destroyed, yeah, because they then they will be able to survive psychologically, spiritually, and do what they have to do in life, in history, right? Here's an example of someone who is not who was able who was not a victim of the racism that he was exposed to. My friend Dany Laferrière, the fiction writer of Haitian fiction writer in Canada. He entered a bar one day after having received bad news from home, and was getting ready to sit down and do what he had to do. He noticed the person sitting next to him, the patron sitting next to him, who was a white man, and Dany is black, yeah, begin to making comments about his presence and taking his glass and moving away from him. And Dany looked at him and said, "You know what? I have no time for your racism today, especially today. I've just received news that my best friend in Port-au-Prince has died, and I have no time for you." Okay? So he was more concerned with his pain, which was real, than any pain that the man's racism could cause. As a result of that exchange, he actually tapped into the humanity of the man, who then felt empathy, and then he came to accompany him, and they stayed there drinking until 3 o'clock in the morning, and going over the grief, mutual griefs, yeah. Because often the person who hates is also unwilling to tap into his or her own pain, yeah. And so I have more to say, but no more minutes in which to say. Thank you.
So Jim, you gonna have any closing comments?
No, I think that was
Okay.
was quite beautiful.
I think so as well. And so, yeah, so thank you all for your insightful comments and questions and thoughts. And thank you to our panelists. So thank you for the ad.
Thank you. And thank you for your help.
We also want to thank our panelists so much for coming out here, and they all were so interesting to speak to on the phone. So there are a couple minutes before we're going to get kicked out of here, so if you do want to ask them questions, take the time now, but they all have so much to say, and we obviously don't have time to stay here.
I have a question for the doctor. I was wondering, like, do you really believe that a person who's a victim of racism cannot be racist themselves?
By all means. And by all means. That's what a racist society, racism teaches you to be racist. You know, being a victim of racism teaches you to be racist. In fact, quite often, if you look closely at some of the anti-racist discourse, you'll find some of the logics that comes from racist discourse inherited. Yeah, and that is one of the most dangerous. So thank you very much for mentioning that. Yeah, we should never go under the assumption that somehow the fact that you're a victim of racism clears you, right, from the possibility of being a racist yourself. On the contrary, because of your direct exposure, if it was successful, chances are that you'll be a racist too.
Well, I'll just give you from a different perspective that a South African writer by the name of Eric Miedi said it is not possible for black people to be racist because they simply don't have the power to be racist. As a black person, no matter how much, as the example of Barack Obama gives, no matter how much I may hate white people, no matter how much I may say, I hate white people, I cannot exclude a white person from attending Harvard University, for example. Whereas you, as a black person, people will see your face and go, oh no, we cannot possibly admit her to our university, she's black. Chuck the application to the one side. So there is a particular kind of black consciousness, a particular kind of expression of black consciousness, which says it is not possible for people of color to be racist because they do not have the power, no matter how much racism they may feel, they do not have the power to create the institutions that excludes people of other races from participating in certain social activities. And so your racism in some ways, as my grandmother would say, it's like sweat on a dog's fur. It just like evaporates into thin air. It doesn't have consequence. Whereas the racism that is institutionalized has consequence.
And this goes out the differences between prejudice and racism too. That
Right.
seems like very similar in terms of like the idea of racism being something that has this element of power, and without it.
Right.
So again, we're talking about definitional things too. Like what does it mean to
Exactly.
be have kind of deeply embedded feelings of hate towards another group versus being able to enact that in a with using power to diminish their opportunities in life.
May I ask a quick question in relation to this? I know if we pathologize an ostensibly white working class, talking about things like stubby fingers and protruding brows and bad smell and laziness, does that become racism or is it still classism? And what does that border say about modern knowledge? Because the two positions. Well, they're stereotypes, but if they come from an elite that has power, that's able to exclude those people from Harvard University because they don't have the right social graces, and they look ugly at the table. You know, if we're taking social constructivism, and yet I'm not making an argument that, like, you can equate the suffering of black people in the Americas or around the world with those people, right? It's qualitatively different, but it's a question because the two perspectives that I've just heard, I've not put together an answer in my own mind. I flash between them. I don't know.
I don't disagree. I think we're speaking about different things, different aspects of the phenomenon. Yeah, but the fact is that the victim of racism who is not able to perpetrate comparable racism against that, the victimizer, right, of his or her racism, can, however, apply it to somebody with less power.
This is the hierarchy.
So it becomes a hierarchical thing, yeah? And you can see it about, the bickering among minority groups, right? Or the relationship between, different portions of the black diaspora, including the population, the black population in the United States from different ancestries. Yeah?
Right.
You can see that all the time.
But
Sorry.
do we have time
No,
for
I just